Step outside.
Officer, I'm just having coffee. Is there a problem?
I said outside. Now.
Give me 1 minute.
Officer, listen carefully. I'm Agent Luther Carlson, FBI. I'm undercover right now on a major operation. You need to leave this area immediately. My people will explain everything to your department later.
The black man's voice was low and urgent as he tried to discreetly show his credentials to the police officer who had approached him in the crowded downtown coffee shop. Officer Walter Matthews didn't even glance at the credentials, his eyes fixed on the man with suspicion and disdain as his hand remained resting on his service weapon, his body language conveying authority and distrust in equal parts. Walter's body camera captured every second of what happened next, every word and action that would destroy 2 years of meticulous work, cost taxpayers over $200,000 in wasted resources, and allow a major drug trafficker and his organization to escape justice. Special Agent Marcus Johnson had spent 740 days living a lie, embedded in one of the most dangerous drug cartels on the West Coast, missing his son's birthdays, holidays with his family, sleeping with one eye open every night knowing one wrong word could cost his life. He was literally 5 minutes away from obtaining the final piece of evidence from a meeting that was about to happen in that coffee shop, when Walter decided a black man sitting alone in an upper-middle-class establishment needed to be investigated. Before we continue with this absolutely devastating story, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments, because what you're about to witness is a perfect example of how racism isn't just about hurt feelings, but about real-world consequences that affect criminal investigations, public safety, and justice. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is going to get more and more intense, and you won't want to miss a single detail of how one racist police officer destroyed a multi-million-dollar federal investigation in less than 10 minutes, simply because he couldn't believe a black man could be an FBI agent. This isn't fiction. This really happened, and every second was documented on body camera footage that would eventually become evidence in multiple investigations into police misconduct and federal accountability. Special Agent Marcus Johnson was 37 years old and had worked for the FBI for 12 years, starting as an intelligence analyst before moving to field work, where he quickly gained reputation as one of the best undercover agents in the division. He had a natural talent for building convincing personas and maintaining deep cover for extended periods, skills that made him the ideal candidate when the FBI needed someone to infiltrate the Morales organization, a sophisticated drug trafficking operation that moved approximately $20 million in methamphetamine and fentanyl annually through a network of distributors across the West Coast. Marcus had gone through months of preparation before assuming the identity of Marcus Torres, a former Chicago convict looking for West Coast connections to expand his own drug operations, AOE. Backstory that was meticulously constructed with fake arrest records, verifiable references from actual criminals who were cooperating with law enforcement, and a complete legend that could withstand scrutiny from paranoid criminal organizations that routinely investigated any new associate. He spent 2 years slowly working to gain trust within the organization, starting with small deliveries and gradually taking on larger responsibilities, until he was eventually brought into the inner circle, where he had access to details about suppliers, distribution routes, money laundering operations, and the complete leadership structure. The operation had cost the federal government approximately $200,000 to this point, including Marcus's salary and benefits, during 2 years of undercover work, rent, and maintenance expenses for 3 different safe house apartments he used during the operation, payments to informants who helped establish his cover, surveillance equipment that was deployed to monitor organization members, and the costs of coordinating with local law enforcement agencies that were aware of the operation and instructed to avoid actions that could compromise Marcus's cover. Beyond the financial cost, there was the human cost to Marcus and his family. He had missed 2 of his son's birthdays, wasn't present when his mother was hospitalized with pneumonia, missed his daughter's dance recital, and spent most of 2 years unable to maintain meaningful contact with the people he loved, because phone calls and electronic communications were too risky when you were living among criminals who would kill you without hesitation if they suspected you were law enforcement. His wife Sarah had essentially raised their 2 children as a single mother during this period, living with constant anxiety about whether her husband would come home alive, unable to tell even extended family or close friends where Marcus really was or what he was doing, because the operation was so sensitive that only a handful of people in the FBI even knew of its existence. On that specific Tuesday morning, March 26th, Marcus was executing the final phase of his undercover operation. He had arranged a meeting with Diego Morales himself, the organization's leader, who rarely met directly with distributors, but had agreed to meet Marcus Torres because Marcus had proven so reliable and profitable during the last 6 months. The meeting was scheduled to happen at a discreet downtown coffee shop at 10:30 in the morning, a public location Diego favored for certain business meetings because the ambient noise made electronic surveillance difficult and the crowd of regular customers provided natural cover. Marcus arrived 45 minutes early, as he always did, to assess the location, identify potential security threats, and position himself where he could maintain situational awareness while recording the conversation with a tiny device hidden in his wristwatch. He was wearing casual but expensive clothes that fit his persona as a successful mid-level trafficker, sitting at a corner table with his laptop open and a coffee beside him, making it look like he was just another professional working remotely. Diego was supposed to arrive in exactly 5 minutes when Officer Walter Matthews entered the coffee shop on his routine patrol, swept the space with eyes that had been trained to look for anomalies, and decided the black man sitting alone in expensive clothes using an expensive laptop looked suspicious enough to warrant closer investigation, a decision based purely on racial profiling that was about to have catastrophic consequences that would ripple far beyond that coffee shop. Marcus saw Diego enter and leave within seconds, his heart sinking as he realized the entire operation had just collapsed before his eyes because of the racist stubbornness of a local officer who couldn't accept that the federal credentials he was holding were genuine. He turned to Walter with barely contained urgency in his voice and said the target he was waiting for had just seen the police presence and fled, that 2 years of undercover work had just been destroyed, that Walter needed to call that supervisor number immediately, because this was now a critical situation requiring immediate federal intervention. Walter still didn't believe, his body camera capturing every second as he said if Marcus was really an FBI agent, then he should understand proper police procedure and wait patiently while verification was conducted through official channels. Marcus grabbed his own phone and called his supervisor directly, his voice tense as he quickly explained his cover had been blown by a local officer refusing to acknowledge his credentials, that Diego had seen the interaction and fled, and that he needed someone to confirm his identity immediately before the situation deteriorated further. Marcus's supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Robert Chen, answered within 2 rings, having been trained to always be available during active operations, and Marcus handed the phone to Walter, saying his supervisor was on the line and would confirm everything. Walter took the phone reluctantly, clearly still skeptical, and Chen immediately identified himself with his full title and badge number, confirming Marcus Johnson was indeed an FBI special agent, currently working on a high-priority undercover operation that had just been compromised. Chen asked Walter for his name and badge number, information Walter provided, because refusing to identify himself to an FBI supervisor would have been problematic even for someone as stubborn as him. Chen then said something in a tone that left no room for discussion, that Walter had potentially destroyed a 2-year federal investigation through his refusal to recognize valid credentials, that every second of this interaction was being recorded on his body camera and would become evidence, and that Walter needed to immediately leave the area and report to his own supervisor to explain why he had interfered with a federal operation, despite receiving proper identification. Walter's expression changed as the reality of the situation began penetrating, his face pale as he realized he wasn't dealing with some civilian he could intimidate, but with actual federal law enforcement that had authority over him and the connections to make his professional life extremely difficult. He tried to mumble an apology about just doing his job and following procedure, but Chen cut him off, saying they would discuss his actions in detail later, and for now, Walter needed to leave immediately. Walter finally left the coffee shop, his departure about 8. Minutes too late to salvage anything about Marcus's operation, and Marcus sat at his table, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. 2 years of his life, 2 years away from his family, 2 years living with constant danger and psychological stress, 2 years of meticulous work, building trust and collecting evidence, all destroyed in less than 10 minutes because a local officer operating on racial bias decided a black man with an FBI badge must be lying. Marcus began making calls to other members of his team, alerting them the operation was compromised and they needed to immediately begin shutting everything down and securing the safety of any informants or assets that might be at risk now that the Morales organization knew or strongly suspected there was law enforcement in their operation. Marcus's phone buzzed with urgent text messages from surveillance agents who had been monitoring Diego's movements, confirming Diego had left the area immediately after exiting the coffee shop, had made several phone calls to numbers associated with other organization members, and appeared to be activating emergency protocols the organization used when they suspected police compromise. Within hours, the entire Morales organization would either be in hiding or would have destroyed evidence, making it impossible to proceed with arrests or charges despite 2 years of investigative work. Marcus finally left the coffee shop and went directly to the FBI office where an emergency meeting was already being organized to assess the damage and determine next steps. Chen was furious in ways Marcus had rarely seen, not angry at Marcus who had done everything right given impossible circumstances, but furious at Walter Matthews and the police department that employed him. Chen had already contacted the police chief, demanding an immediate meeting to discuss how one of his officers had interfered with a federal operation, despite receiving proper credentials and explicit instructions from an FBI supervisor. The operation team gathered to review what could be salvaged, and the conclusion was devastating. Without the meeting with Diego, they didn't have the final evidence they needed for federal RICO charges that would have taken down the entire organization. And now that the organization knew there was police compromise, they would be hiding all evidence and witnesses, making it impossible to build the case they had spent 2 years preparing. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case confirmed that without that final meeting and the evidence it would have produced, he didn't have enough confidence to file charges that would result in convictions, meaning Diego Morales and his organization that had flooded communities with deadly methamphetamine and fentanyl would continue operating, because Walter Matthews couldn't believe an FBI badge held by a black man was real. The impact of this failure extended beyond just the immediate case. Informants who had risked their lives providing information had to be hastily relocated because they were now at heightened danger since the organization knew there was a leak somewhere in their ranks. One specific informant, a mid-level man in the organization who had been crucial in establishing Marcus's cover, was found dead 2 weeks later in circumstances that strongly suggested retaliation from the organization, though it could never be conclusively proven because the organization was sophisticated enough to make deaths look like accidents or unrelated crimes. That informant's family had to be placed in witness protection and relocated to another part of the country at government expense, adding more financial and human costs to the total price of Walter's mistake. Marcus had to be immediately pulled from undercover work because there was now risk the Morales organization might have identified him and could retaliate against him or his family, meaning one of the FBI's best undercover agents was now permanently burned for any future operations involving drug trafficking on the West Coast. His wife, Sarah, was notified they would have to consider relocation for their safety, which would mean uprooting their children from their schools, leaving their home and community, and starting their lives over somewhere the Morales organization couldn't reach them. Another devastating impact on a family that had already sacrificed so much for Marcus's work during those 2 years. Walter Matthews had been a police officer for 8 years and had a disciplinary record that included 3 formal complaints of excessive use of force and 2 of discriminatory conduct, none of which had resulted in more than written warnings or short suspensions because the police union always defended him and his supervisors rarely wanted to deal with the paperwork and conflict that came with holding officers properly accountable. He had developed a reputation among residents of color in the district he patrolled as someone who made pretextual traffic stops, questioned people in neighborhoods where he felt they didn't belong, and generally operated with an us versus them mentality that viewed certain communities as inherently criminal rather than citizens he had sworn to protect. On that specific morning, Walter was making his usual rounds through the downtown business district, an area that was predominantly white and affluent during the day when office workers and professionals filled the coffee shops and restaurants. When he entered that specific coffee shop and saw Marcus sitting alone in his corner, something in his brain registered it as out of place. A black man in expensive street clothes in an establishment that normally catered to white-collar clientele, and instead of simply recognizing that thought as the racial bias it was and moving on, Walter decided to act on it. Marcus saw Walter enter and immediately felt his stomach sink, because he recognized the pattern. He had seen that look countless times in his life, both as a civilian and as an undercover agent, the look of a police officer who had decided you were suspicious based purely on your appearance. He discreetly checked his watch and saw it was 10:27. Diego was supposed to arrive in literally 3 minutes, and any kind of disruption or police attention at this moment could blow the entire operation, because Diego was extremely cautious and would cancel the meeting at the first sign of police activity in the area. Marcus kept his eyes on his laptop, pretending not to notice Walter approaching, hoping against hope the officer would simply pass by him. But instead, Walter stopped directly beside his table and said loudly enough for several people around to hear that he'd like to ask some questions. Marcus looked up, keeping his expression neutral and polite, his mind racing through scenarios about how to handle this without compromising his cover, but also without allowing the situation to escalate in ways that could ruin 2 years of work. He told the officer calmly that he was just working on his laptop and enjoying his coffee, nothing wrong or illegal, hoping this would satisfy Walter and make him move on. Walter wasn't satisfied. He asked what Marcus was doing at this specific coffee shop where he worked, if he lived in the area, questions designed not to collect legitimate information, but to establish control and demonstrate authority. Marcus responded he was waiting to meet someone for a business meeting, deliberately vague because he couldn't give details that might compromise his cover, but also not wanting to lie to a police officer in ways that could create additional problems. Walter pressed for more details, asking the name of the person Marcus was meeting, what kind of business they would discuss, why they chose this specific location, his voice becoming more demanding and his eyes scanning Marcus up and down as if searching for visible contraband or weapons. Other customers in the coffee shop began noticing the interaction, some people glancing curiously, while others deliberately avoided looking, not wanting to get involved in anything that looked like a potential police situation. Marcus could feel the situation slipping from his control, could see on his watch it was now 10:29, and Diego could walk in literally any second, and the sight of a police officer clearly interrogating someone at his table would be a huge red flag that would send Diego running in the opposite direction. It was at this moment Marcus made the decision to reveal his true identity to Walter, something he absolutely didn't want to do because exposing himself as law enforcement in public, where any member of the Morales organization could potentially see him or hear about it later, was incredibly dangerous. But the alternative was allowing Walter to continue his public interrogation that would definitely blow the meeting with Diego and probably end the entire operation anyway. So Marcus made the calculated choice to try to end this quickly by showing his federal credentials. He told Walter in a very low voice that he needed to speak with him privately, then lifted slightly from his chair and discreetly pulled his wallet, showing his FBI badge and identification card, while whispering he was Special Agent Marcus Johnson on an active operation, and Walter needed to step away immediately or risk compromising a federal investigation. Walter's body camera captured the badge and credentials in clear and unequivocal footage. There was absolutely no ambiguity about what Marcus was showing him or what he was saying. A reasonable officer would have immediately recognized the situation, discreetly apologized, and left the coffee shop. But Walter wasn't a reasonable officer operating based on logic and professional procedure. Walter's response to Marcus's credentials revealed exactly what kind of racial bias was operating in his head. He looked at the badge and ID, but instead of accepting their authenticity, he immediately became even more suspicious and aggressive. Walter said loudly, captured perfectly on his body camera, that anyone could buy a fake FBI badge online and he would need to verify Marcus's identification through his dispatcher. Marcus tried to explain in an urgent but low voice there was no time for that he had a critical meeting happening literally now that was part of a 2-year investigation, and that Walter, calling and verifying through official channels, would take too long and create exactly the kind of visible police presence that would blow everything. He provided Walter with the direct phone number of his supervisor at the FBI office and told Walter to call that number specifically, not through dispatch, and his supervisor would confirm everything in 30 seconds. Walter refused, saying he would follow standard procedure, and if Marcus was really an FBI agent, then he wouldn't have a problem waiting a few minutes while Walter verified through appropriate channels. It was at this exact moment, 10:31, according to the timestamp on the body camera footage, that Diego Morales entered the coffee shop, saw Marcus sitting with a uniformed police officer standing beside his table, clearly in some kind of official interaction, and immediately turned and walked out without saying a word or making eye contact, 2 years of work evaporating in an instant, because Walter Matthews couldn't believe a black man could be a federal agent. The internal investigation into Walter Matthews' actions began within hours of the incident, with the FBI demanding complete access to his body camera footage and all records related to his service history and previous disciplinary complaints. Police Chief Thomas Brennan met with Chen and other FBI supervisors in a tense meeting where it immediately became clear the department was facing significant federal liability for what Walter had done. Chen spared no detail in describing the full scope of the damage: $200,000 in taxpayer resources wasted, 2 years of agent time lost, multiple informants now in danger, a major drug trafficker and his organization still operating freely, because one of his officers couldn't accept that a black man could be federal law enforcement. Brennan initially tried to defend Walter, saying he was just following procedure for verifying identification, but Chen threw a printed copy of the department's guidelines on the table and pointed to the section that explicitly stated officers should respect federal credentials presented by agents from other agencies, especially when the agent declares they're on active operation. The body camera footage was played in the conference room, everyone watching as Walter looked directly at Marcus's genuine FBI badge and identification, but refused to accept them, insisting they could be fake, despite having no reason to believe this beyond his own racist assumptions about who could or couldn't be a federal agent. The police department tried to resolve the situation quickly by placing Walter on administrative leave while conducting their own internal investigation. But the FBI made clear this wasn't enough, and they expected real disciplinary action that included termination. The police union immediately got involved, defending Walter, arguing he had made an error in judgment but hadn't violated any specific department policy and didn't deserve to lose his job over a situation where he was trying to do the right thing by verifying identification. Chen responded by providing documentation of 3 previous complaints against Walter involving discriminatory treatment of black citizens, cases the department had minimized or dismissed, but now looked extremely relevant given what happened in the coffee shop. The pattern was undeniable. Walter had a history of treating black people with suspicion even when there was no legal basis to do so, and this time his racial bias had interfered with a federal investigation and caused measurable harm to public safety by allowing dangerous criminals to remain free. The FBI also made clear they were considering federal criminal charges against Walter for obstruction of justice and interference with a federal operation, charges that could result in prison time beyond simply losing his job, a threat that finally made both Walter and his union realize the severity of the situation they were dealing with. Marcus had to go through extensive debriefing sessions where he detailed every aspect of the failed operation, providing information that would be used to assess whether any part of the investigation could be salvaged and also to document the full scope of damages for eventual legal action against Walter and the department. He described how he had spent weeks setting up the meeting with Diego, how incredibly difficult it had been to gain enough trust to be brought in to meet the leader directly, how that meeting would have provided evidence of Diego's direct links to specific criminal activities that would have made RICO charges virtually bulletproof. He explained that without that final evidence, the case they built over 2 years had gaps that federal prosecutors didn't think they could fill, meaning they likely wouldn't file charges against Diego or his top lieutenants because they couldn't guarantee convictions. Marcus's frustration and anger were palpable during these sessions, but he maintained professionalism while providing the necessary details, though his colleagues could see the emotional toll this entire disaster was taking on him. He had dedicated 2 years of his life to this operation, had made sacrifices most people could never understand, and it had all been destroyed not through any mistake of his or because the criminal organization was too smart, but because a local officer with racial bias decided an FBI badge in black hands must be fake. The story leaked to media within a week, initially through anonymous sources within the FBI who were furious about what had happened and wanted public pressure on the police department to take appropriate action. The headlines were devastating for Walter and his department, variations of "Racist Officer Destroys Federal Investigation" and "Police Bias Lets Drug Dealers Walk Free," dominating local and then national news as the story gained traction. The body camera footage was leaked and went viral. Millions of people watching Walter refused to accept Marcus's legitimate federal credentials, while Diego Morales walked in and out of the coffee shop in the background. Perfect visual evidence of how racism wasn't just about hurt feelings, but had real measurable consequences for public safety and criminal justice. Commentators and law enforcement experts went on television to dissect what had happened, with many pointing out this exemplified larger systemic problems about how police officers treat black people, even when those black people are fellow law enforcement with equal or greater authority. Civil rights activists highlighted the case as a perfect example of how racial bias permeates every level of law enforcement, that even an FBI federal agent wasn't immune from being profiled and treated as suspicious based purely on the color of his skin. The total financial cost of Walter's failure continued climbing as more details emerged about exactly how much money had been invested in the operation over 2 years. Beyond the $200,000 in direct costs, there were now additional costs to relocate informants, provide increased security for Marcus and his family, conduct the internal investigation into Walter, and deal with the legal and administrative fallout from the failed operation. Conservative estimates placed the total cost above $300,000, taxpayer money that had been wasted because one officer couldn't overcome his racial prejudices for 10 minutes. But the financial cost was really secondary to the cost in terms of public safety and justice. The Morales organization would continue trafficking drugs that killed people, would continue corrupting communities, would continue generating violence and addiction, all because they had escaped charges when they should have been taken down. Families who would lose loved ones to fentanyl overdoses in the coming months and years would never know those deaths could have been prevented if the organization supplying the drugs had been stopped when it should have been. An invisible but real connection between Walter's actions in that coffee shop and future human suffering that would continue for years to come. Public pressure on the police department intensified dramatically as more people watched the viral body camera footage and understood the magnitude of what Walter had done. Protesters began appearing outside the central precinct, demanding Walter's immediate firing and comprehensive reforms to how the department handled racial bias among its officers. Civil rights organizations filed a petition with over 50,000 signatures calling for not just Walter's dismissal, but also a federal investigation into the entire department to determine if there were systemic patterns of racial discrimination that allowed officers like Walter to operate without proper accountability for years, despite multiple complaints. The city council held public hearings where citizens, many of them black and Latino people, testified about their own experiences with Walter and other officers who had profiled them, stopped them without justification, or treated them as criminals for simply existing in certain neighborhoods. The testimonies painted a picture of a department where racial bias wasn't aberration, but common practice, where officers felt they could harass residents of color without consequences, because the system protected them through strong unions, supervisors reluctant to discipline, and an us versus them culture that viewed certain neighborhoods as enemy territory instead of communities to serve and protect. The FBI proceeded with federal criminal charges against Walter Matthews in an unusually aggressive move that signaled how seriously they viewed his actions. He was formally charged with obstruction of a federal investigation, a charge that carried potentially up to 5 years in prison if convicted. Federal prosecutors built their case around the body camera footage showing Walter receiving valid FBI credentials and explicit instructions from an FBI supervisor, but refusing to back down, his actions demonstrating deliberate intent to interfere with a federal operation rather than simply honest mistake or confusion about proper procedure. Walter's defense attorney tried to argue his client had been trained to verify all identification regardless of who presented it. But prosecutors countered with expert testimony from other federal agents and law enforcement professionals who unanimously agreed a reasonable officer would have immediately recognized and respected FBI credentials, especially when accompanied by confirmation from a supervisor. The real question underlying the trial wasn't whether Walter had interfered with the operation, that was unquestionable, but rather why he had done so when he'd been given all necessary information to know Marcus was a legitimate federal agent on active operation. The answer to that why was documented in his own disciplinary history, showing a pattern of treating black citizens differently from white citizens. Marcus was called to testify at Walter's criminal trial, an experience he found profoundly difficult because it meant publicly reliving that moment where 2 years of his work evaporated because of another man's racism. He described for the jury exactly what had been at stake in that coffee shop, how he had spent 24 months building the operation, the risks he had taken, the sacrifices his family had made, and how everything depended on that final meeting with Diego Morales that Walter destroyed through his refusal to accept an FBI badge held by a black man. Marcus explained he had shown his credentials discreetly, specifically to protect his cover, that he had provided his supervisor's direct number for immediate verification, that he had done everything correctly. But none of it mattered, because Walter had operated on an underlying assumption that a black man couldn't be a federal agent. Marcus's testimony was devastating in its calm specificity, without histrionics or exaggeration, just a factual recitation of what had happened and its consequences. The defense attorney tried during cross-examination to paint Marcus as having overreacted or not followed appropriate procedure in showing credentials, but Marcus methodically dismantled each suggestion with references to actual FBI training and protocols for undercover agents in compromised situations. The jury watched the body camera footage multiple times during the trial, and each viewing made it clearer that Walter had no legitimate defense for his actions. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on the federal obstruction charge. Walter showed little emotion when the verdict was read, apparently having accepted his fate was sealed when the body camera footage became public and impossible to deny or contextualize differently. The sentencing hearing happened 3 weeks later, where both Marcus and FBI representatives provided impact statements detailing the complete damages caused by Walter's actions. Chen, Marcus's supervisor, provided updated financial estimates showing total costs had now exceeded $400,000 when you included all ongoing costs of relocating informants, security for Marcus, and resources spent trying to salvage anything from the ruined operation. He also provided intelligence reports showing the Morales organization had expanded its operations in the months since the incident, moving even more drugs and generating more victims precisely because they had avoided the charges they should have faced. Several community members also spoke, describing how they or family members had been affected by the opioid epidemic the Morales organization was fueling, connecting the failure to stop that organization directly to the human costs of addiction, overdoses, and destroyed families. The judge heard everything and then delivered a sentence that sent a clear message about how seriously he viewed Walter's conduct. Walter Matthews was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, a sentence that was on the higher end of the guidelines range, but which the judge justified by pointing to Walter's pattern of conduct, the magnitude of the harm he caused, and the need to send a message that law enforcement wasn't above the law and would be held accountable when their actions interfered with justice. The judge specifically stated in his sentencing remarks that the most disturbing element of this case was that Walter had been given all the information he needed to know Marcus was a legitimate federal agent, but had chosen not to believe that information because it didn't fit his racial prejudices about who could hold certain positions of authority. He noted Walter's racial bias had not just hurt Marcus personally, but had allowed dangerous criminals to avoid justice, placing entire communities at continued risk from drug trafficking and related violence. The sentence included not just prison time, but also 3 years of supervised release after incarceration, during which Walter would be prohibited from working in any law enforcement capacity and would be required to complete extensive racial bias training, though everyone knew he would never work as an officer again. The police union issued a weak statement saying they respected the court's decision, but continued to believe Walter had been scapegoated, a position that only reinforced criticisms that police unions were part of the problem by consistently defending officers even when their actions were unquestionably wrong and harmful. The police department faced its own reckoning in the weeks and months following Walter's conviction, with the Department of Justice initiating a formal pattern and practice investigation to determine if there was systemic discrimination within the organization that allowed officers like Walter to operate without proper oversight. Federal investigators went through thousands of records of traffic stops, field reports, and citizen complaints over 5 years, looking for statistical patterns that could reveal racial bias in how officers exercise their discretionary authorities. What they found was disturbing but not surprising to anyone who had been paying attention to community complaints. Black drivers were stopped at disproportionately high rates compared to white drivers, even when controlling for factors like location and time of day. People of color were much more likely to be searched during traffic stops, despite lower rates of actually being found with contraband. And complaints about racial misconduct were routinely dismissed or minimized by supervisors who prioritized protecting officers over serving the community. The pattern and practice report eventually released by DOJ was scathing in its conclusions, determining the department had engaged in a pattern of discriminatory enforcement that violated the Constitution and federal civil rights of residents. The city was forced to enter a consent decree requiring comprehensive reforms including new training, increased supervision, improved accountability systems, and ongoing federal monitoring to ensure compliance. Chief Brennan, who had initially defended Walter and minimized the incident as an isolated misunderstanding, found himself under growing pressure to resign, as it became clear problems in the department were systemic rather than limited to a few bad officers. City council members who had previously supported Brennan began publicly calling for his departure, arguing leadership that had allowed a culture of racial bias to thrive couldn't be trusted to implement the necessary reforms. Brennan held out for several weeks, but eventually announced his retirement, framed as a personal decision, but clearly forced by the political reality that he had lost support from key stakeholders. His replacement was carefully selected to signal commitment to reform, a black chief from a neighboring department known for progressive policing practices that emphasized community engagement and accountability. The new chief, Angela Morrison, inherited an organization that needed fundamental rebuilding from its foundations, and she made clear in her inaugural speech that officers who couldn't police without bias didn't belong in the department regardless of how strong their union defended them or how many years they had served. Her appointment was met with cautious hope by racial justice activists who had spent years demanding change, but remained skeptical that words would translate into real action. Marks Ho went through his own process of healing and rebuilding as he tried to process the trauma of having 2 years of his life destroyed by racism from a fellow law enforcement officer. He worked with a therapist specializing in service-related PTSD to deal with the anger, frustration, and sense of betrayal that came from being racially profiled not by a criminal, but by a police officer who should have been a partner in law enforcement. Sarah, his wife, also went through therapy as they worked together through the strains that 2 years of undercover separation followed by the trauma of this incident had placed on their marriage. Their children, who were young enough not to fully understand what had happened, but old enough to feel the emotional impact of the family upheaval, needed their own forms of support as their lives were upended by security relocation and changes that came with a father who had been absent for years, suddenly back, but dealing with his own trauma. The FBI offered Marcus opportunities for other assignments, but none involving undercover work because he was permanently burned for that type of operation after this incident. He eventually accepted a position as an instructor at the FBI Academy, where he could use his experiences, both his successful operations and the devastating failure of the Morales operation, to train the next generation of agents on both technical skills of undercover work and the realities of operating as a black law enforcement officer in a system that still carried deeply ingrained racial bias. The Morales organization continued operating in the months after the coffee shop incident, though intelligence suggested they had become significantly more cautious in their operations after learning they had nearly been infiltrated by federal law enforcement. Diego Morales himself was eventually arrested 18 months later in an unrelated operation conducted by DEA that had no connection to Marcus's undercover work, but the charges against him were for much lower-level offenses than the RICO charges the FBI would have filed if Marcus's operation had been successful. Diego got an 8-year sentence in federal prison instead of the 20 to 30 years he would have faced under RICO charges, and his organization remained largely intact with lieutenants taking over while he was incarcerated. The communities that had been devastated by the Morales organization's drugs continued suffering, overdose rates remaining stubbornly high as fentanyl continued flooding local markets. There were real victims with names and families, people like 23-year-old Jennifer Martinez, who died from a fentanyl overdose 6 months after the coffee shop incident. The drugs that killed her traceable through distribution network back to suppliers who should have been in prison if Marcus's operation hadn't been destroyed. Jennifer's parents never knew their daughter's death could have been prevented if one police officer had been able to overcome his racism for 10 minutes on that Tuesday morning. The case attracted ongoing attention from academics and researchers studying the intersection of race, law enforcement, and criminal justice. Multiple journal articles were published analyzing the incident as a case study on how racial bias operates even within law enforcement, how officers from different agencies sometimes treat colleagues of color with the same suspicion they apply to civilians, and how institutional costs of racism extend beyond individual cases of discrimination to undermine effectiveness of criminal investigation and public safety. The body camera footage was used in countless law enforcement training programs as an example of what not to do and how to recognize when racist assumptions are driving decision-making instead of actual threat assessment or suspicious behavior. Some police academies now included the case as mandatory part of recruit training, forcing future officers to confront the reality that racial bias could destroy not just individual lives, but entire investigations with implications for public safety that rippled through communities. The story served as a powerful reminder that racism wasn't simply a matter of etiquette or hurt feelings, but had real measurable consequences that could be calculated in wasted dollars, ruined operations, unpunished criminals, and lost lives that could have been saved. 1 year after the incident, Marcus was invited to speak at a national conference on law enforcement and race relations, an event that brought together police chiefs, federal agents, academics, and civil rights activists to discuss paths toward reforming American policing. He initially hesitated to accept the invitation because speaking publicly about the experience meant reliving the trauma and exposing himself to additional scrutiny. But Sarah encouraged him, saying his story had power precisely because it came from within the law enforcement system rather than outside it. Marcus took the stage before an audience of over 1,000 people and told his story with a raw honesty that left many in the room clearly uncomfortable. He described the sacrifices he made during 2 years undercover, the risks he took, the dedication he had to the work of dismantling a dangerous criminal organization, and then described how it was all destroyed, not because he made a mistake or because the criminals were smarter, but because a police officer looked at him and saw race before seeing badge. Marcus didn't spare details about the emotional impact, speaking openly about the anger he felt, about the betrayal of being racially profiled by someone who should understand badges, came in all colors, about the frustration of knowing Diego Morales was free because Walter Matthews couldn't see past racial prejudices. The most powerful part of Marcus's presentation came when he addressed the police officers in the audience directly, many of whom were likely feeling defensive about criticisms of police racism. Marcus told them he understood their work was difficult, that he himself had done risky and demanding law enforcement work, but that the difficulty of the work didn't excuse allowing racial bias to drive decisions. He asked them to imagine being stopped by a fellow officer who refused to believe their credentials were real, who demanded additional verification, who treated them as suspects instead of professional colleagues, all because of the color of their skin. He asked how many white officers in the room had ever had their credentials questioned when they presented them, how many had been made to wait while another officer called to verify their badge was real, how many had been treated with suspicion by fellow law enforcement, despite carrying proper identification. The room fell silent, because everyone knew the answer. White officers never experienced that kind of disrespect from other officers because their credentials were automatically presumed legitimate. Marcus then connected his personal experience to broader systemic patterns, pointing out that if even an FBI agent wasn't immune from being racially profiled by law enforcement, what did that say about how ordinary black civilians were treated when they encountered police without credentials or badges to show, without FBI supervisors to call, without resources or knowledge to fight unjust treatment? He argued that reforming law enforcement required not just policy changes, but fundamental cultural shift where officers actively recognized and confronted their own biases instead of denying or minimizing them. Marcus's presentation received a standing ovation from many in the audience, though he noticed some police officers remained seated with crossed arms, clearly resistant to the message even in the face of such clear evidence of how racial bias had caused measurable harm. During the following Q&A session, a police chief from a mid-sized city asked what Marcus thought would have happened differently if Walter had had better training on implicit bias. Marcus responded that while training was useful, it wasn't a magic bullet because Walter had received implicit bias training as part of his department's mandatory continuing education, but clearly that training hadn't penetrated deeply enough to overcome ingrained racial prejudices when confronted with a real situation. He argued effective training needed to be accompanied by real accountability, that officers needed to know there would be genuine consequences if they let bias drive their actions, because without accountability, training was just a box-checking exercise officers could complete and then ignore in their actual practices. Marcus also emphasized the importance of supervisors and department leadership taking complaints about racial misconduct seriously instead of automatically defending officers, pointing out Walter had 3 prior complaints that had been dismissed or minimized, allowing him to continue operating with bias until he eventually caused catastrophic damage to a federal investigation. Another attendee asked if Marcus still believed in law enforcement, given what he had experienced, a question clearly designed to create a gotcha moment, but which Marcus answered with careful thought. He said he believed in the ideals of law enforcement, in the concept of serving communities and protecting people from harm, but that he was deeply disillusioned with the frequent failure of law enforcement institutions to live up to those ideals, especially when it came to how they treated people of color both as civilians and as fellow officers. Marcus explained he still wanted to contribute to law enforcement through his teaching work, but that he had lost the naivety he once had about the system being fundamentally fair and meritocratic, now understanding through painful experience that race mattered in every law enforcement interaction, whether you were on the law's side or the other side of it. He noted the irony that he had spent 2 years pretending to be a criminal, building an entire persona as a drug trafficker, but that performance had been easy compared to the constant challenge of being accepted as a legitimate federal agent when other law enforcement officers looked at him and saw suspect first and badge second. Marcus's honesty resonated through the room, his willingness to speak about uncomfortable aspects of law enforcement. Many in the profession preferred to ignore or deny, creating space for more honest conversations about how to address systemic racism within policing. After the conference, Marcus was approached by dozens of other law enforcement officers of color who shared their own stories of being racially profiled by fellow officers, stories that hadn't made national headlines but were equally disturbing in demonstrating how pervasive the problem was. A Hispanic detective from Los Angeles described being stopped by officers from his own agency while driving his personal car, being ordered out of the vehicle at gunpoint until one of the officers eventually recognized him from work. A black Border Patrol agent spoke about being consistently questioned by colleagues when entering federal facilities, despite wearing full uniform and carrying visible identification. A black U.S. Marshal described having a gun drawn on him by a local police officer who had responded to the same crime scene, the officer assuming a black man with a gun must be a suspect instead of federal law enforcement. These stories confirmed what Marcus already knew but was validating to hear from so many others, that his experience wasn't aberration, but part of a pattern where law enforcement officers of color routinely had to prove their legitimacy in ways white colleagues never did. The conversations also revealed how much constant self-monitoring officers of color did, always conscious of how they were perceived, always prepared to be questioned or challenged, always carrying extra documentation and having backup plans in case their credentials weren't accepted, a mental and emotional burden white colleagues never had to carry. 2 years after the coffee shop incident, an investigative news report from a major network revisited the case and tracked what had happened to everyone involved, creating a comprehensive portrait of the long-term consequences of those 10 minutes that changed so many lives. The report revealed Walter Matthews was serving his prison sentence at a medium-security federal facility where he apparently kept a low profile and avoided trouble. But fellow inmates reported he had never truly accepted responsibility for what he did, still describing himself as victim of political correctness and claiming he had been scapegoated to serve a broader agenda about police racism. The report also tracked down several officers who had worked with Walter and found some had left law enforcement entirely after the scandal, embarrassed to be associated with a department that had allowed such a monumental failure to happen, while others remained, but reported the incident had fundamentally changed how they approached their interactions with citizens, especially people of color. One of Walter's former partners admitted on camera he had witnessed Walter making racist comments and questionable stops multiple times over the years, but had never reported it, because the department's culture made clear you didn't snitch on fellow officers no matter what you witnessed, a blue omerta that had allowed Walter's problematic behavior to continue unchecked until it exploded spectacularly in that federal case. The report spent significant time with Marcus's family, showing how they were rebuilding their lives after the upheaval of his undercover work and then the trauma of the incident. Sarah spoke candidly about how difficult it had been to have her husband back physically but emotionally distant while he processed what had happened, about difficult conversations they had about whether he should leave the FBI entirely versus finding a new way to serve within the agency. Their children, now a bit older, talked about having to move to a new school and make new friends, about knowing their dad was some kind of hero who had tried to stop bad people, but also understanding he was hurt in ways they didn't fully comprehend. Marcus himself had settled into his teaching role and found meaning in it, training the next generation of agents not just on the mechanics of undercover work, but on navigating the complexities of doing that work while black, in a system that didn't always recognize or respect their authority. He admitted he still carried anger about what Walter had destroyed, that he probably always would carry that weight, but that he was trying to channel that negative feeling into positive change through his work educating others and advocating for reforms within law enforcement. The report captured Marcus conducting a training session where he showed Walter's body camera footage to a class of new recruits, using it as a case study on how not to conduct an identification check and how to recognize when racist assumptions were driving police decision-making. The report also investigated what had happened to the Morales organization after Marcus's undercover operation was compromised, revealing that while Diego was in prison, serving his 8-year sentence, the organization had adapted and continued operating under new leadership. Law enforcement intelligence suggested the organization had actually expanded its territory and drug volume in the years since the incident, partly because the FBI investigation's failure had created a federal enforcement vacuum that allowed them to operate with less scrutiny. The report interviewed families of overdose victims whose loved ones had died from drugs traceable back to the Morales distribution network. People like Jennifer Martinez's parents, who cried on camera as they looked at photos of their daughter and talked about the future she would never have because of a fentanyl overdose. The reporters made the explicit connection between Walter's failure to accept Marcus's credentials and these subsequent deaths, arguing that while Walter hadn't personally injected the drugs that killed Jennifer and others, his actions had been a causal link in the chain that led to those tragedies by allowing suppliers to remain operational when they should have been arrested. It was a controversial argument some critics felt stretched Walter's responsibility too far, but it resonated with victims' families who were desperate to understand how the system had failed their loved ones so completely. Question for you watching right now. Do you think Walter Matthews bears responsibility for the deaths of people who overdosed from drugs supplied by the organization he helped escape justice? Type yes or no in the comments, because this raises really difficult questions about how we draw lines of responsibility when it comes to consequences of police misconduct. The report also examined the reforms that had been implemented at the police department under Chief Morrison's leadership, documenting both progress and ongoing resistance. The chief had instituted a new early warning system designed to identify officers showing patterns of disproportionately stopping drivers of color or receiving multiple complaints about discriminatory treatment. Officers flagged by this system were required to undergo additional training and increased supervision before their problems escalated to the point of causing significant harm. The system had identified 12 officers in the first 18 months who showed problematic patterns, half of whom had improved their behavior after intervention, while others had been quietly encouraged to leave the department. Morrison had also created a civilian oversight advisory board composed of community members who reviewed certain categories of complaints and provided outside perspective on whether departmental actions were appropriate, a move that had generated significant resistance from the union, but had begun rebuilding some trust between the department and communities of color that had been more aggressively policed. The news piece concluded by returning to the coffee shop where everything had happened, now operated by new owners who kept a framed copy of an article about the incident on the wall as part of the location's history. The reporter interviewed several regular customers who had been there that morning, including the witness who had recorded part of the interaction on his own phone and whose video had been used as corroborating evidence at Walter's criminal trial. That witness, a middle-aged white man named Robert Chen, unrelated to the FBI supervisor, spoke about how witnessing that confrontation had fundamentally changed his understanding of how black people experience law enforcement differently than he did, that he had always assumed if you weren't doing anything wrong, then you had nothing to fear from police, but seeing an officer refuse to accept legitimate federal credentials from a black man had made him realize that for people of color, even doing absolutely everything right didn't guarantee you would be treated with respect or your authority would be recognized. He had become an advocate for police reform in his community in the years since, showing up at city council meetings to speak about what he witnessed and why change was necessary. The report ended with footage of the empty coffee shop early in the morning, the camera slowly panning to the corner table where Marcus had sat 2 years before, waiting for the meeting that would have completed his undercover operation, a moment of visual silence inviting viewers to reflect on all the lives that had been altered by those 10 minutes of racism captured on body camera footage. The impact of Marcus's case reverberated beyond law enforcement to reach broader conversations about how racism operates in professional spaces and institutions that consider themselves meritocratic or objective. Business schools began using the case as an example in classes on organizational bias, pointing out that if even the FBI, with all its training and procedures, could have an operation destroyed by a local officer's racial assumptions, then no organization was immune from having bias undermine its operations and effectiveness. The case appeared in corporate diversity training programs as illustration of how implicit bias wasn't just a matter of social justice or political correctness, but had real measurable business consequences in terms of failed projects, missed opportunities, and wasted resources. Management consultants used the story to argue for more robust accountability systems where decisions could be audited for bias and individuals could be held responsible when their racial assumptions led to organizational failures. The narrative had transcended its law enforcement origins to become a broader parable about the costs of allowing unchecked prejudice to operate in professional environments where decisions had high-stakes consequences for other people and for larger institutional missions. Within the FBI specifically, the case led to comprehensive review of how undercover agents were protected and supported during long-term operations. New protocols were established requiring closer coordination with local law enforcement agencies, including in-person briefings where undercover agents could discreetly introduce themselves to senior officers who would then distribute descriptions and alerts through their ranks to prevent accidental interference. The FBI also created a new emergency verification mechanism where undercover agents could send a coded text message that would generate an automatic callback from an FBI supervisor to any law enforcement officer questioning their credentials, a system designed to provide immediate verification without requiring the undercover agent to break cover by making an open phone call. These procedural changes were useful, but also deeply sad because they existed specifically because Black and brown agents couldn't trust that their federal credentials would be automatically respected by local law enforcement the same way white agents' credentials were. The fact that special procedures were necessary to protect agents of color from being racially profiled by other law enforcement officers was tacit admission that a systemic problem existed that no amount of training had fully resolved. Marcus found unexpected purpose in becoming a mentor for other law enforcement officers of color, navigating their own experiences with racism within the system. He started an informal support group that met monthly where federal agents, state police officers, and local cops who were Black, Latino, Asian, or from other minority backgrounds could share experiences and strategies without fear of judgment or professional repercussion. The meetings were often emotionally intense as participants shared stories of being stopped by fellow officers, having authority questioned by colleagues, being mistaken for suspects or security guards instead of law enforcement, experiences that resonated painfully with Marcus's own trauma. The group developed practical resources, including recommendation cards on how to handle situations where an officer from another agency questioned their credentials, de-escalation techniques specific to when you were being racially profiled by a fellow officer, and a list of attorneys specializing in police misconduct who understood the unique dynamics of cases where the victim was herself law enforcement. Marcus found that helping others process their experiences also helped him process his own, that there was healing in community and solidarity even when the broader system remained resistant to real change. The story also inspired a new branch of academic research examining how law enforcement officers of color experienced the profession differently from white colleagues. Sociologists conducted studies showing Black officers reported significantly higher rates of being stopped or questioned by other officers when off duty, that they often felt they had to work twice as hard to earn the same level of respect and trust white colleagues received automatically, and that many considered leaving law enforcement entirely because of cumulative experiences with racism from both colleagues and the community. These studies challenged the common narrative that law enforcement's problems with race were primarily about white officers mistreating Black civilians, revealing a more complex reality where law enforcement itself was a site where racial hierarchies and prejudices were reproduced, even among people who technically shared the same profession and supposedly the same values. Researchers argued that understanding the experiences of officers of color was crucial to reforming law enforcement, because these officers were both insiders who understood police culture and outsiders who experienced its racist manifestations directly, giving them unique perspective on what needed to change and how change could be effectively implemented. The third anniversary of the coffee shop incident passed quietly for most people who had followed the story when it was in the news. But for Marcus and his family, it remained a significant milestone. They had made an annual ritual of having dinner together on that date and speaking honestly about how the event continued affecting their lives. Sarah shared she still occasionally woke from nightmares about receiving a phone call saying Marcus had been injured or killed during undercover work, residual anxiety from those 2 years when she lived with constant fear for his safety. Their children, now entering their teenage years, talked about how their father's story had shaped their own understanding of race and justice, how they had become more aware and sometimes uncomfortably conscious of racial dynamics in their schools and communities. Marcus himself reflected that while the anger had diminished over time, replaced by something more like melancholic resignation, he still struggled with the question of whether all the pain and sacrifice had been worth it when the end result was that the criminals he had risked everything to stop remained free because of the racism of someone who should have been an ally. There was no satisfying answer to that question, no way to make the emotional math add up to something redemptive, just the reality that he had done his work with excellence and dedication, only to see it destroyed by another person's prejudices who refused to see past the color of his skin. 5 years after the incident, Marcus received official recognition from the FBI in the form of the Medal for Distinguished Service, one of the highest honors the agency awards, citing his dedication during the 2-year undercover operation and his subsequent contribution to training agents and improving safety protocols for undercover work. The ceremony was bittersweet because while Marcus appreciated the recognition, he knew the medal didn't change the fundamental fact that the operation had failed and criminals remained free because of another person's racism. During his acceptance speech before fellow agents and FBI leadership, Marcus spoke with characteristic honesty about how the honor felt incomplete when Diego Morales was still scheduled to be released from prison in just 2 years and would undoubtedly return to leading criminal operations that would continue destroying lives through drug trafficking. He used the platform to challenge the audience about whether they had truly learned the lessons of what happened, whether they had internalized that fighting racism within law enforcement wasn't optional work or public relations initiative, but fundamental requirement for doing the job effectively. Marcus noted he had received a medal, but Walter Matthews had received only 3 years in prison for destroying a federal investigation that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and allowed a dangerous criminal organization to avoid justice, a disparity that said something about how the system valued recognizing heroism more than punishing racism that undermined law enforcement missions. Marcus's story eventually reached Hollywood when an independent producer optioned rights to make a feature-length documentary about the case, seeing in it a microcosm of larger issues about race, law enforcement, and justice in America. Marcus was initially hesitant about participating, worried dramatization would sensationalize his experience or reduce it to entertainment, but was convinced when producers committed to keeping focus on systemic issues rather than just his personal story, and giving voice to other victims of law enforcement bias, including families of people who had died from overdoses of drugs from the Morales organization. The documentary, titled Badge and Prejudice: The True Cost of Police Racism, premiered at a major film festival and received critical acclaim for its nuanced portrayal of how racism operated at multiple levels of the criminal justice system. Walter's body camera footage was at the documentary's center, those 3 minutes of video serving as irrefutable evidence that even when confronted with legitimate federal credentials and explicit instructions from an FBI supervisor, a white police officer couldn't accept that a black man could be a federal agent. Critics praised the documentary for avoiding both excessive didacticism and false balance, instead letting the evidence speak for itself while contextualizing the individual. Incident within larger historical and contemporary patterns of how law enforcement had treated black people both as suspects and as fellow officers. When Walter Matthews was finally released from prison after serving his complete sentence with good behavior time, he emerged into a world that had moved on without him, but hadn't forgotten what he did. He tried to keep a low profile, moving to a different state where he hoped fewer people would recognize him. But the internet had a long memory, and the body camera footage remained easily findable for anyone searching his name. Walter struggled to find steady employment because potential employers doing even basic background checks would discover his federal conviction for obstructing an investigation and the racial context that had motivated his actions. He eventually found work at a warehouse where management didn't care about his past, as long as he showed up on time and did the work. A dramatic fall for someone who once carried a badge and had authority to arrest people. A reporter who tracked Walter down for a follow-up interview found a bitter man who still saw himself as victim, blaming media for ruining his life, blaming political correctness for making it impossible for officers to do their jobs, blaming Marcus for not being more cooperative, despite footage clearly showing Marcus had done everything right and Walter had done everything wrong. The lack of genuine remorse or self-reflection was disturbing, but not surprising to those who had followed the case. Walter apparently was one of those individuals who would never accept that his own choices and prejudices had led to his downfall. For Marcus, life had found a new balance that was different from what he had imagined when he first joined the FBI, but still had meaning and purpose. He continued his teaching work, now as a senior instructor with influence over how the next generation of agents was trained in both undercover work and awareness of racial justice issues. He also became a public advocate for law enforcement reform, testifying before legislative committees about the need for better accountability and oversight, speaking at conferences about systemic racism within law enforcement, and working with civil rights organizations to develop best practices that would reduce chances of similar incidents happening in the future. Sarah had returned to her own career after years putting it on hold to support Marcus's undercover work, and their children were thriving in school despite the upheavals they had experienced during formative years. The family had found therapy, and time had healed some wounds, though Marcus admitted he would probably always carry the psychological scar of having his life's work destroyed by racism, a pain that would never fully disappear but that he had learned to live with and channel in productive directions. He occasionally wondered about lives that could have been saved if the Morales organization had been taken down as planned, about overdoses that could have been prevented, about families that wouldn't have been destroyed by addiction. But he also recognized that dwelling in those counterfactual thoughts was a path to despair rather than constructive action. Marcus's story became a teaching case not just about racism, but about resilience, about how an individual could experience profound injustice and still find paths forward that weren't defined only by trauma. He often told young agents the most important part of his story wasn't the operation's destruction, but what he chose to do afterward, how he decided to use the experience to educate others and advocate for change, instead of letting bitterness consume him or giving up on law enforcement entirely. Marcus argued real change in institutions came from insiders who understood systems intimately enough to know what needed reforming and had credibility to be heard when they proposed changes. His case had created ripples that extended far beyond that moment in the coffee shop, influencing policies, training protocols, and conversations about race within law enforcement in ways that would continue impacting how future generations of agents operated. Walter's body camera footage remained a powerful teaching tool precisely because there was no ambiguity about what it showed. No way to rationalize or explain differently what happened when a white police officer looked at legitimate federal credentials held by a black man and decided they must be fake. Those 3 minutes of video captured in microcosm a larger truth about how racism operated, not through obvious malice, but through assumptions and prejudices so deeply rooted that people acting on them often didn't even recognize it was happening, making it both more dangerous and harder to eradicate from institutions that saw themselves as objective and meritocratic. Marcus's story was a reminder the fight against racism in law enforcement wasn't complete, that progress was possible but required constant vigilance and willingness to hold people accountable when their actions fell short of standards the profession claimed to uphold, and that sometimes the most important cases were those showing not dramatic spectacles of hatred but mundane everyday failures to recognize the full humanity and authority of people of color, even when they carried the same badges and had taken the same oaths to serve and protect.